There's a state that watched a $5.8 billion surplus evaporate down to a projected $600 million in roughly 3 years, where the state auditor went on the public record and called the budget broken, where the General Revenue Fund is on track to be completely exhausted by 2028, and where the local political conversation continues to argue about everything except the actual math. The state is Missouri, and it's not even the worst one on this list. Across America, the fiscal story of 2026 has been quieter and stranger than the headlines suggest. The real collapse has been happening at the state level, quietly, inside audited financial reports nobody opens. According to the National Association of State Budget Officers' June 2026 survey of all 50 states, nearly half of all U.S. states are quietly cutting services for fiscal year 2027. Almost half the country is slashing budgets at the exact same time, and almost nobody connected the dots. According to state-line analysis of the same data, rising costs, slow revenue growth, and federal funding cuts have produced the most synchronized state-level fiscal pressure since 2009. According to Truth in Accounting's 2025 Financial State of the States report, 25 American states already lack the assets to cover their existing bills, with the structural shortfall reaching $765 billion nationally. And underneath those numbers, the structural conditions have not stabilized. The COVID-era cash flood gave every state a cushion that lasted exactly as long as the federal money lasted. Federal relief and inflated tax receipts stacked on top of each other. States treated it like permanent income. It was not, and the surplus just ended. Then came the federal trigger. Federal Title I education funding was cut by 10% in the FY 2027 appropriations bill, creating a $1.89 billion shortfall states now have to absorb out of their own pockets. In this countdown, we're exposing 10 states quietly running out of money in 2026. Not the cliché version where every state is technically broke. The real one. The version where the COVID surplus has fully evaporated, where workforce buyouts and layoffs have begun, where the bills are starting to roll downhill to property taxpayers, and where the structural math caught up. One state has watched its general revenue turn into a death spiral by 2028. Another carries the most extreme single-source revenue dependence in America. A third has already laid off more than 200 state workers in a single agency. Subscribe before your state's next budget revision arrives. Like the video if your state just raised a fee, cut a service, or quietly froze hiring while telling you everything is fine. Let's break it down. Number 10. Pennsylvania, the Keystone State, where the Keystone is quietly running out of money, and the state government keeps insisting otherwise. There's a state running a budget around $48 billion that has been drawing down on its reserves for multiple consecutive cycles, where pension obligations continue compounding against revenue that has not kept pace. Where net domestic migration was negative 30,718 in the year ending July 2025, and where the broader Northeast fiscal pattern has hit Pennsylvania as hard as any state on the list. Welcome to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is the state at the geographic center of the Northeast fiscal restructuring story, with pension obligations, infrastructure aging, and demographic decline all compounding against revenue growth that has not kept pace. The numbers. Pennsylvania carries a taxpayer burden of $9,400 per resident per truth in accounting 2025. Pennsylvania pension system is funded at approximately 66% per Reason Foundation 2024. Pennsylvania net domestic migration was negative 30,718 in the year ending July 2025, per Census Bureau. Vintage 2025 estimates. Pennsylvania state budget reserves have been drawn down across multiple cycles, with structural deficit warnings issued by the Independent Fiscal Office. What it's like. Living in Pennsylvania is like dating someone with a six-figure salary who still hits you with a Venmo request to split the appetizer. Picture this. You're a 51-year-old in suburban Pittsburgh in 2026. Your property tax has climbed. Your kids moved to Charlotte and Nashville for work. Your retired friends keep moving to Florida. You're starting to plan retirement somewhere else, where it gets uncomfortable. Pennsylvania's structural problem is that when a state this large starts running thin, it does not announce it with a press conference. It announces it with delayed infrastructure, hiring freezes, and a slow trim of the services residents actually use. The reserves keep shrinking. The reform efforts have been substantial but slow. The cumulative effect on residents has shown up in everything from property tax bills to bank branch closures to outmigration. Sharp contrast. Pennsylvania and Tennessee tell two stories. Tennessee carries a taxpayer surplus of $10,900 and has been gaining residents at sustained rates. Pennsylvania carries a $9,400 burden and has been losing them. Same general region, very different fiscal management. Number 9. Texas, the Lone Star state that loves to brag about no income tax, quietly handing you the bill anyway through a fee structure that climbed faster than any tax it ever banned. There's a state where Houston just passed a budget around $7.5 billion that leaned heavily on new municipal fees to balance, where the property tax effective rate sits at 1.74%, where the legislature has been implementing reform measures while local taxing entities have continued raising bills, and where the no income tax brand has been masking a fee and property tax structure that compresses household budgets. Welcome to Texas. Texas is the state whose no state income tax brand has been the loudest marketing pitch in America and whose municipal fee math has been quietly catching up. The numbers. Texas Houston passed a $7.5 billion budget in June 2026 with new municipal fees stapled to multiple service categories. Texas property tax effective rate sits at approximately 1.74%, among the highest in America per Tax Foundation. Texas Houston controller publicly warned the budget relied on what he described as gimmicks to balance. Texas vehicle registration, toll, and administrative fees climbed across multiple categories in 2025 and 2026 budget cycles. What it's like. Living in Texas's fiscal math is like dating someone who promised they had no debt and then introduced you to 17 new monthly subscriptions. Picture this. You're a 67-year-old retiree in suburban Austin in 2026. Your property tax bill climbed roughly 40% over 5 years. Your vehicle registration arrived in March higher than last year for reasons nobody explained clearly. Your toll bill climbed at the start of 2026. You did not get a tax increase. You got nickeled to the same place by another name. Where it gets uncomfortable. Texas's structural problem is that when the surplus is gone, the state does not raise the tax it promised to never raise. It raises the things it never called taxes. Higher vehicle registrations, toll hikes, hidden administrative fees stapled to everything you renew. The cumulative outcome is the same fiscal pressure delivered through a different name. Sharp contrast. Texas and Tennessee are both no state income tax states. Tennessee has lower property taxes, lower municipal fees, and a balanced budget. Texas runs higher property taxes and higher fees, with the difference invisible until the bills arrive. Same income tax framework, very different total cost of staying. Number 8. Iowa. The Hawkeye state where more than 200 state IT workers were laid off in a single agency reorganization, and the state government described it as modernization. There's a state where the Reynolds administration laid off more than 200 state IT workers in 2025 as part of an outsourcing decision, where the budget pressures have continued to compound across multiple agencies, where the effective property tax rate reached 1.25% in 2025, and where the cumulative state-level fiscal pressure has begun showing up in workforce decisions. Welcome to Iowa. Iowa is the state where the layoff pattern that the NASBO survey warned about has begun arriving in real headcount terms at real agencies. The numbers: Iowa laid off more than 200 state IT workers in 2025 per KCCI, reporting on the Reynolds administration reorganization. Iowa effective property tax rate reached 1.25% in 2025, the seventh highest in America per ATM 2026. Iowa state revenue growth has slowed substantially as post-COVID tax receipts normalized. Iowa school district funding remains heavily dependent on local property taxes. What it's like. Living in Iowa is like dating someone wholesome and reliable who just sent the whole IT department a buyout email and called it spring cleaning. Picture this. You're a 49-year-old state IT worker in Des Moines in 2026. You opened the email about the reorganization in March. Your colleagues started receiving layoff notices in April. Your final day of state employment was June. Your retirement plan assumed 12 more years of state work. Your spouse is asking what the plan is now. Where it gets uncomfortable. Iowa's structural problem is that the agency reorganization was real, but the workforce reduction was also real, and the pattern is exactly what the NASBO survey predicted. When a state starts paying people to leave or laying them off in batches, the surplus conversation is over. That is not belt-tightening. That is triage. Sharp contrast. Iowa and Nebraska are direct neighbors. Nebraska has not implemented comparable IT workforce reductions. Iowa's outsourcing decision concentrated the workforce shock in a single year. Same planes, slightly different fiscal posture. Hey, before we get into the top 7, the states we're about to cover are the ones where the structural fiscal collapse has been most aggressively documented, where the NASBO survey signals have already become visible workforce reductions, and where the audited balance sheets diverge most sharply from the official budget narratives. If this list has been useful, hit subscribe, because the next one we're working on is 10 American cities where the property tax bill just doubled. And property tax is exactly where this story is about to land in your living room. Like the video if your state just raised a fee, cut a service, or quietly froze hiring while telling you everything is fine. Drop a comment if your state has quietly cut services this year. Now let's keep going. Number 7, Colorado, the centennial state where 173 IT workers were laid off in 2025. Where the budget shortfall has driven workforce restructuring across multiple agencies, and where the no-cushion math caught up faster than the state acknowledged. There's a state that laid off 173 IT workers in May 2026 as part of an Office of Information Technology shakeup, where statewide home values are down roughly 2.4%, where wildfire-driven insurance disruption has compressed household budgets, and where the cumulative fiscal pressure has begun producing visible workforce reductions. Welcome to Colorado. Colorado is the state whose mountain and tech brand has been quietly absorbing structural fiscal pressures that the brochures still do not mention. The numbers. Colorado laid off 173 IT workers in May 2026 per Denver Post reporting on the Office of Information Technology restructuring. Colorado statewide home values are down approximately 2.4% year-over-year per Zillow Home Value Index. To Colorado wildfire insurance carriers have reduced coverage in multiple counties since 2023. Colorado property tax assessments have climbed across the Front Range as reassessment cycles caught up to pandemic-era values. What it's like. Living in Colorado is like dating someone outdoorsy and gorgeous whose monthly expenses you didn't fully understand until you moved in, and the buyout letter just made it worse. Picture this. You're a 44-year-old state IT contractor in Denver in 2026. Your team got the reorganization announcement in March. The layoff list landed in May. Your home insurance went up 28% in 2025. Your property tax assessment came in higher than expected. Your spouse is doing the math on Phoenix or Salt Lake City. You're not sure that's an upgrade. Where it gets uncomfortable. Colorado's structural problem is the layered cost increase combining with workforce restructuring the state did not telegraph. The home values plateaued. The insurance kept climbing. The state workforce got reduced. The household budget compressed without the home equity gain that used to offset it. Sharp contrast. Colorado and Utah are both Mountain West. Utah is cooling later and has not announced comparable workforce reductions. Colorado went first and harder. Same region, different sequencing. Number 6, Kentucky. The bluegrass state where the pension system has been one of the most extensively documented fiscal disasters in modern American state government. And the budget pressure has begun producing workforce reductions across multiple agencies. There's a state where every taxpayer carries an $11,500 burden, where the Kentucky Employees Retirement System non-hazardous plan was funded below 20% in 2018, and required asset allocation changes to maintain liquidity, where pension debt per capita reaches $8,626, and where the cumulative fiscal pressure has begun producing buyout offers and workforce reductions. Welcome to Kentucky. Kentucky is the state with one of the most distressed individual pension plans in America, where the structural pension underfunding has compounded for decades and the fiscal architecture has continued to compress. The numbers. Kentucky carries a taxpayer burden of $11,500 per resident per Truth in Accounting 2025. Kentucky public pension system is funded at approximately 50.1% per Equitable Institute analysis. Kentucky Employees Retirement System, non-hazardous plan, was funded below 20% in 2018, with the Kentucky Public Pensions Authority reducing the investment return assumption to 5.25%. Kentucky has implemented multiple pension reform measures since 2017, with limited improvement in the structural funding gap. What it's like. Living in Kentucky is like dating someone with a great heart, real character, and a retirement account they've been quietly drawing down for years. Picture this. You're a 58-year-old state employee in Frankfurt in 2026. You've been contributing to the pension for 30 years. Your retirement benefits have been adjusted multiple times by reform measures. You're not certain what your actual retirement income will be. You're starting to research private retirement options to supplement. Where it gets uncomfortable. Kentucky's structural problem is that the state has been making promises to public workers that the funding could not sustain. The reform efforts have been substantial. The CURE's non-hazardous plan being forced to maintain unusually low-risk asset allocations to preserve liquidity for current benefit payments is documented and unprecedented. The structural challenge of funding promises made during decades of less aggressive contribution requirements remains substantial. Sharp contrast. Kentucky and Tennessee are direct neighbors. Tennessee's pension system is funded at 104%, the strongest in America. Kentucky's is funded at 50.1%, among the worst. Same region, completely different fiscal outcomes. Number 5, Oklahoma. The Sooner State, whose energy-dependent revenue model looked brilliant in 2022 and looks structurally fragile in 2026. There's a state where severance tax revenue from oil and gas production drives a substantial share of the general fund, where energy price volatility has produced revenue swings that the budget cannot absorb without reserves, where the rural healthcare network has been collapsing in parallel, and where the cumulative effect has put the state in a much more fragile position than the headline economic data suggests. Welcome to Oklahoma. Oklahoma is the state where the energy revenue dependence has been a feature when commodity prices were high and a structural vulnerability when they were not. The numbers. Oklahoma's severance taxes on oil and natural gas production represent a substantial portion of general fund revenue. Oklahoma has lost 13 rural hospitals to closure or conversion since 2010, per Chartis 2026. Oklahoma has 48 rural hospitals at risk of closure, roughly 64% of its rural facilities per CHQPR analysis. Oklahoma state workforce reductions have been considered across multiple agencies as revenue volatility compressed the budget. What it's like. Living in Oklahoma's fiscal math is like dating someone in the oil business who keeps insisting the next quarter will be huge while the bills keep arriving. Picture this. You're a 56-year-old in rural Oklahoma in 2026. Your local hospital is operating reduced services. Your state employee neighbor is talking about a possible buyout package next quarter. The energy prices that powered the state's recent budget years have softened. The cumulative pressure is showing up in healthcare access, school funding, and municipal services. Where it gets uncomfortable. Oklahoma's structural problem is that a state with this much revenue dependence on a single sector is structurally exposed to that sector's volatility in a way diversified states are not. A state with a diversified tax base wobbles in a downturn. A state riding one commodity gets wiped out. That is revenue volatility, and it is the quiet killer on this list. Sharp contrast. Oklahoma and Tennessee are both south-central states with similar geographic profiles. Tennessee has more diversified revenue and a stronger pension system. Oklahoma's energy revenue dependence concentrates the risk. Same region, very different fiscal architecture. Number 4. Wyoming. The equality state whose budget rides on coal, natural gas, and oil revenue more aggressively than almost any other state in America, and whose 2026 budget pressure has confirmed the structural vulnerability. There's a state where mineral severance taxes and federal mineral royalties combined account for the dominant share of state revenue, where the population of roughly 580,000 cannot absorb shocks the way larger states can, where the lack of broad income tax has meant the state cannot easily replace lost commodity revenue, and where the cumulative pattern is the textbook definition of revenue volatility. Welcome to Wyoming. Wyoming is the state with the most concentrated commodity revenue dependence in the continental United States, and the math has been working only as long as the commodity prices kept it working. The numbers. Wyoming mineral severance taxes and federal mineral royalties combined account for the dominant share of state revenue per Wyoming Department of Revenue data. Wyoming has no state income tax, eliminating one of the primary backup revenue sources other states use. Wyoming population of roughly 580,000 produces limited sales tax revenue, elasticity to absorb shocks. Wyoming truth in accounting. Taxpayer surplus reached $27,200 in 2025 when commodity revenue was flowing, but the structural exposure to coal, gas, and oil prices is among the highest of any state. What it's like. Living in Wyoming's fiscal math is like dating someone with a great salary that depends entirely on one industry, and you both pretend that's fine. Picture this. You're a 62-year-old in central Wyoming in 2026. Your state employee neighbor mentions the agency budget is being reviewed. Your local school district is having a quiet conversation about consolidation. The coal extraction in your county has slowed. The natural gas prices have softened. The cumulative effect is showing up in small ways that compound. Where it gets uncomfortable. Wyoming's structural problem is that the commodity revenue model worked brilliantly when prices were high and concentrates the risk when they are not. The state has built reserves that help absorb shocks. The structural vulnerability remains. A 30% commodity price drop produces a budget shock that diversified states do not experience. Sharp contrast. Wyoming and Montana are direct neighbors. Montana has more diversified revenue, including a state income tax. Wyoming has the commodity dependence and no income tax backup. Same region, very different shock absorbers. Number 3, New Mexico. The land of enchantment, whose oil and gas severance taxes have been propping up a budget that would otherwise look much worse, and whose 2026 fiscal year is testing how much of that prop remains. There's a state where oil and natural gas severance taxes account for a substantial share of general fund revenue, where the Permian Basin production has been the underlying source of recent revenue strength, where the median household income sits below the national average, and where the cumulative fiscal pressure has been hidden by the commodity revenue that may not continue at recent rates. Welcome to New Mexico. New Mexico is the state where the commodity revenue strength has masked underlying structural conditions that look much more fragile when the oil price moves the wrong way. The numbers. New Mexico severance taxes on oil and gas production account for a substantial share of general fund revenue per State Department of Finance and Administration data. New Mexico's Permian Basin production has driven recent revenue strength but exposes the state to oil price volatility. New Mexico taxpayer burden reached $7,800 per resident per Truth in Accounting 2025. New Mexico pension debt per capita reaches $8,641, among the top 10 in America. New Mexico net domestic migration was negative 10,526 in the year ending July 2025, shrinking the future tax base. What it's like. Living in New Mexico's fiscal math is like dating someone artistic and interesting whose financial situation depends entirely on a single client. Picture this. You're a 41-year-old in Santa Fe in 2026. Your salary is below what your skills would earn across the state line in Texas. Your state employee neighbor mentions the budget is more fragile than the headlines suggest. The Permian production has been strong, but the prices have softened. Your cousin moved to Austin in 2023 and now owns a home. You're considering the same path, where it gets uncomfortable. New Mexico's structural problem is that the state's recent fiscal strength has been almost entirely commodity-driven, and the underlying structural conditions look much weaker when you strip out the oil and gas revenue. The federal employment is stable, but not growing. The tourism economy is seasonal. The energy sector is volatile. The result is a state where wages have not kept pace with cost of living increases, and the revenue base is one commodity move away from a shock. Sharp contrast. New Mexico and Texas are neighboring states. Texas has diversified employment beyond commodities and a much larger sales tax base. New Mexico has narrower diversification and deeper commodity exposure. Same region, very different economic structures. Number 2. Missouri, the show-me state, where the state auditor publicly declared the budget broken on the record, and the $5.8 billion surplus is on track to be completely exhausted. By 2028, there's a state that watched a $5.8 billion surplus evaporate to a projected $600 million in roughly 3 years, where the state auditor used the word broken to describe the budget on the public record, where the projected deficit reaches $1.7 billion, where the general revenue fund is on track to be completely exhausted by 2028, and where the cumulative pattern is the textbook definition of a state running out of money. Welcome to Missouri. Missouri is the state where the audited math caught up most publicly in 2026, with an elected watchdog using language that no political conversation can soften. The numbers. Missouri General Revenue Fund declined from a $5.8 billion surplus to a projected $600 million in roughly 3 years per the state auditor's office. Missouri State Auditor Scott Fitzpatrick publicly described the budget as broken in June 2026 testimony. Missouri faces a projected $1.7 billion deficit if the governor does not balance the budget, per the state auditor's analysis. Missouri General Revenue Fund is on track to be completely exhausted by 2028, per the auditor's projections. Missouri net domestic migration was negative 7,612 in the year ending July 2025 per census, vintage 2025. What it's like. Living in Missouri's fiscal math is like dating someone with a great heart who keeps quietly admitting they are losing money every month, and you both pretend it's fine because admitting otherwise means everything has to change. Picture this. You're a 45-year-old state worker in Jefferson City in 2026. You have put in 20 years. You read the buyout offer on your desk and do the quiet math on whether your pension is about to get frozen. You did everything right. The structural math does not care. Your property tax bill arrived in March, climbing alongside the school district's funding pressure. Where it gets uncomfortable. The auditor did not whisper the warning. He publicly declared the budget broken. Sit with that for a second. An elected watchdog looking at audited numbers used the word broken on the record. That is not partisan noise. That is the math caught up. And when the state runs out of money, the bill does not vanish. It rolls downhill to property taxpayers and to the homeowners who never read the audit. Sharp contrast. Missouri and Tennessee are both South-Central states. Tennessee carries a taxpayer surplus and a fully funded pension system. Missouri carries the audited warning and the exhausted reserves. Same region, completely opposite trajectories. Number 1. Alaska. The last frontier state whose fiscal architecture is the most structurally fragile in the country, where the budget rides on oil revenue with no broad income tax and no broad sales tax to catch it when the oil revenue softens. There's a state with no broad state income tax, no broad state sales tax, and a general fund that depends overwhelmingly on petroleum revenue, where the Alaska Permanent Fund provides important offsets but cannot fully replace operating revenue, where the population of roughly 730,000 limits revenue elasticity, and where the cumulative pattern is the most extreme single-source revenue dependence in America. Welcome to Alaska. Alaska is the state with the most structurally fragile fiscal architecture in the country, because when the petroleum revenue declines, there is no second engine and no diversified base to break the fall. The numbers. Alaska has no broad state income tax and no broad state sales tax, eliminating the two primary revenue tools other states use. Alaska petroleum revenue, primarily from oil production royalties and severance taxes, has historically accounted for the dominant share of state general fund revenue. Alaska Truth in Accounting. Taxpayer surplus reached $48,500 in 2025, the second highest in America when oil revenue is flowing. Alaska permanent fund earnings have been increasingly used to fund state operations as petroleum revenue has compressed. Alaska oil production has declined substantially from 1988 peak, with North Slope output trending lower over multiple decades. Reddit quote: Alaska is the state where the budget either looks like the best run in America or like there is no floor at all, depending entirely on the price of one commodity, and the residents keep being told that's fine. What it's like. Living in Alaska's fiscal math is like dating someone whose entire income comes from one client they cannot replace and whose mood depends entirely on whether that client called this month. Picture this. You're a 51-year-old in Anchorage in 2026. Your permanent fund dividend arrived smaller than expected. Your state employee neighbor mentions the budget conversation in the legislature has gotten quieter and more serious. The oil price has softened. The state's fiscal cushion is thinner than the headlines suggest, where it gets uncomfortable. Alaska's structural problem is the most extreme single-source revenue dependence in modern American state government. When the commodity money is flowing, it looks like the best-run state in America. When it dries up, there is nothing underneath. No cushion that does not depend on the same source. No second engine. No diversified base. Just a long fall and a budget with nothing to break it. That is the difference between a crisis a state can claw back from and a crisis that is baked into the structure. Missouri is running out of money fast. Alaska is running out of money with no floor at all. Sharp contrast. Alaska and North Dakota are both petroleum-producing states. North Dakota has a broad sales tax and a smaller relative dependence on petroleum. Alaska has the deepest petroleum dependence and no broad backup revenue. Same industry, very different shock absorbers. So there it is, temporary states quietly running out of money on the public record in the National Association of State Budget Officers June 2026 survey, in State Auditor Warnings, in Truth in Accounting's Financial State of the States analysis, in audited financial reports, and in the daily reality of state services getting thinner. States where the COVID-era cash flood produced a cushion, the leadership treated as permanent. States where the cushion ended and the structural conditions remained. States where workforce buyouts and outright layoffs have already begun. States where the commodity revenue model concentrates the risk in a single sector. States where the audited balance sheet shows what the official budget rhetoric obscures. The American states with stable balance sheets in 2026 share specific characteristics. They have diversified tax bases. They have real reserves that are not dependent on a single revenue source. They have structural discipline that did not treat a temporary windfall like a permanent paycheck. The 10 states on this list have varying combinations of opposite conditions, with one common outcome. The surplus ended. The bills are still arriving. The bills are rolling downhill to property taxpayers and to homeowners who never read the audit. Picture the homeowner 2 streets over from the laid-off state worker. The state can no longer fully fund the schools. The funding shifts to the only lever left, local property taxes, and the homeowner watches the line on the bill climb with no idea it traces all the way back to a NASBO survey nobody read. The good news is you can know this before it hits you. The audit reports are public. The NASBO survey is public. The state auditor warnings are public. You can read them. Most people do not. Most people just complain when the fee doubles and never connect it back to the surplus that quietly ran dry. If this list helped, share it with the friend who keeps insisting their state's budget is fine. Hit subscribe. Because next we are breaking down 10 American cities where the property tax bill just doubled. Drop a comment if your state has quietly cut services this year. And remember, the worst fiscal crisis is not the loud one with the bailout in the headlines. It is the quiet one, where the state just stops fixing the roads,